Thank you, Frank. What I thought I would do now is say a few words about the genesis of Flip, how it came into being, and importantly, how she managed to have a 50-year useful life with a future ahead still. As near as I could tell, I was able to trace the history back to about 5 years before Flip's launching, back in 1957, if you can think back to the age of Sputnik. And that was a year that, among a million other things, our director at the time, Roger Revelle, was inducted into the National Academy of Sciences. Revelle wasted fairly little time getting together with people to have the Academy found a committee on oceanography, and it was called NASCO, and the committee was set to work to identify facilities and equipment that this exploding field of oceanography really needed to get by in the coming decades. A report came out a couple of years after they started, back in 1959, and if you're into such arcane reports, it had two really interesting findings. One was a need for a special purpose research submersible for just oceanographic use, not a submarine, but a research submarine, something that oceanographers could control, run, and operate on their own, take to deep depths. And after a number of years of gestation, that suggestion turned into Woods Hole's submarine Alvin, which is still being operated in different forms today. The second, of course, was the suggestion that there should be a large spar buoy developed. A spar buoy is a buoy that stands up on its end in the water, and the virtue of this is it's very stable when ocean waves go by. And it was decided by this committee, identified by the committee, that such a device was needed for acoustics research, for measuring ocean waves themselves in an environment where the waves didn't rock the ship, and for looking at air-sea interaction. At about this time, Fred Spiess, who was the director of the Marine Physical Lab at the time, was engaged in a Navy program to try to determine just how straight sound propagated in the sea. Sound doesn't go in a straight line in the ocean, but refracts sideways due to the effects of internal waves in the sea, and it bounces off the seafloor at odd angles if the seafloor isn't flat. And the statistics of neither internal waves nor the seafloor was all known back in the late 50s and early 60s. The Navy was interested in this because they were developing new types of weapons launched from submarines that could fire to great ranges. And there was concern that if they launched these things in the direction that sound was coming from, rather than the direction that sound was, they'd be shooting at a mirage. Thanks, Tom. The whole issue revolved around 1 or 2 degrees of accuracy of the bearing, and that was well beyond what any surface ship could do, given the fact that surface ships rock and roll in the waves that are trying to be measured. And it was an ideal job for the large spar buoy that the National Academy was recommending. So thinking big, Fred Spiess wrote a proposal to ONR, or to the Navy at least, where a line item in the budget was one flippable spar buoy needed for acoustic bearing accuracy research, and the cost was $600,000 for this item. And here she is. Now we're here celebrating in part because the proposal was successful. You always celebrate when a proposal was successful, and Flip was funded and duly built at the Gunderson Brothers shipyard in Washington State and launched 50 years ago. But I'd like to just emphasize in the remainder of this talk that a lot of stuff was built 50 years ago. The real genius in Flip is that it's still useful today. It's lasted 50 years and is still useful today. And there's several aspects of the design which are easy to overlook, that play a critical role in the fact that the flip is still a part of our repertoire of research platforms in this country. Specifically, if you notice when you walk down by the side of the ship, the hull has a Coke bottle shape. And that shape was carefully tuned by MPL mathematician Phil Rudnick and by Fred Fisher to minimize the response of the platform to ocean waves. They could adjust the Coke bottle shape so that the platform is as stable as possible. A second aspect that is not at all apparent when you take the tour is that the interior of the hull is filled up with ballast tanks that are put together in a rather clever and, for 1960s naval architecture, a totally unique geometry such that every aspect of the flipping procedure can be done under complete control. That was completely novel, tested for the first time on flip. When we go out tomorrow and do the test flip is going to very slowly come up in the water, then flip up rather quickly at the end, and then spin around a few times afterwards. It always does a kind of a victory spin when she gets in the vertical. If it very slowly came up, then did the victory spin, and then decided to come the rest of the way, it would be really bad. And completely unapparent to the naked eye is some very clever naval architecture that was done for the first time back in this pre-computer era. The last point I'd like to make about, as a 50-year-old thing, why flip is still here today, is just flip's sheer size. Lots of times when you do something, you make a project for the very, very first time, you think it's appropriate to start out with a small-scale demonstration project. But for Spies and for naval architect Larry Gloston, the very first try design was 357 feet long, making flip then and even now the largest vessel in the U.S. oceanographic arsenal. And what Fred Spies understood, but lots of people still don't, is that these spar buoys really work pretty well as designed, and if you make a scaled down version of flip, it would work great provided the ocean scaled down all the waves that you had to face. Indeed, since flip was created, quite a number of scaled down flips have been built, but they've just not been working appropriately. They've not been appropriate for unaccompanied open ocean operations because they really only work in scaled down waves. So flip was launched 50 years ago and successfully did the job of measuring the acoustic fluctuation variability for which it was designed and the proposal was originally written. And that specific Navy program soon ended, but one job led to another and to another and to another, and that process is still going on today. As an interesting historical note, both of the offspring of this 1959 NASCO committee report, the research submarine Alvin and Flip, are funded by ONR today, by Tim Schnorr here from ONR. His long-term efforts in this program for both platforms is greatly appreciated. Let me quit with one final thought about why this is such a strange 50th birthday, why this is so interesting. A number of people have come from Washington and other places, and in the next day or two they'll be flying home. Imagine them going to the airport, walking down the boarding ladder and getting on a nice Douglas DC-6 or a Lockheed Constellation or some other vintage aircraft. And it won't be the case that these people are historic aircraft buffs, but imagine them doing that because the DC-6 was the very best thing there was flying right now. Well, when we get on Flip, half of this is going on. We're getting on a 50-year-old platform, but Flip really is the very best thing we have right now for doing stable research at sea, for doing research where the environment is minimally disrupted, for lifting very heavy payloads up and down with great precision in the sea. And this is what makes Flip unique and what makes her 50th birthday far from being her last. So Flip exists, well, you could imagine designing a newer or better spar buoy today, knowing what we know and with modern materials. It's clear that this original design, this 357-foot rough draft first prototype, was just way ahead of its time. And it's a tribute to Fred Spiess, Fred Fisher, Larry Gloston, the Office of Naval Research, and others who made Flip real back in the time when it was such a great risk. It's also a tribute to Bill Gaines and Tom Golfinos, and others who have kept Flip operating and operating safely for these many years. Okay, at this point, I'll conclude, and now Ken Melville will give a talk that's a little more oriented toward coming science on Flip. Yeah.